trial 1 and trial 2, you'll see the top one, the PR and the MR of 29%. So we're saying about 60% of patients, again a small number, 4 out of 7, but did get some benefit from having this combination. Similar in the bottom, where we see this response rate in 8 patients, about 40%. So that's what really led to moving forward with this, where we see that the potential adding of this HDAC inhibitor plus the Velcade will overcome Velcade resistance. The other HDAC inhibitor that's a little bit farther along development, a little bit behind in development, but is still coming along very nicely, is this drug called Panobinostat, or LBH. And this is another HDAC inhibitor as well. Now, interestingly, if we look at these drugs, both SAHA or Panobinostat, as a single arm, single agent, so a drug by itself, the response rates are quite low. I mean, if we look at this trial, bottom line I want to point out is there's 38 patients, they're all refractory to their most line of therapy, and only 2 of these patients, the one had a VGPR, one had an MR, so only 2 of these patients had a response. It's not very exciting by itself. And really the excitement is when you look at it in combination with Velcade. So we did a trial here with oral Panobinostat, it's a pill that you take by mouth, plus Velcade. The biggest toxicity that we see with this combination, or almost all the HDAC inhibitors, is drops in your blood counts. And so if we look on the right-hand column, this grade 3 and grade 4, you'll see that 80% of these patients will have significant thrombocytopenia or drop in their platelet counts. About 60% of them will have drops in their white count. And they'll also have a fair amount of fatigue and diarrhea with this as well. But the reason that some of this toxicity and some of these side effects are worth it is because of the activity that we see. So if we look in the right-hand bar, we'll see that these are patients who are Velcade refractory. Again, Velcade no longer works for these patients. And we can see combining these 2 drugs together where Velcade probably doesn't work for these patients, HDAC inhibitors or Panobinostat by itself is not that active. But now you start combining together and you overcome that Velcade resistance, and that's what makes it exciting. You can see about 60% of these patients will have a significant benefit with this combination. And so I think this is a lot of where myeloma research is going, is we have active drugs with Velcade and Revlimid, and now we're trying to understand why patients get resistant or refractory to these drugs and then try and overcome them so we can still use these active drugs. And so right now these HDAC inhibitors, again, like we mentioned, this Velcade plus SAHA has already completed the phase 3 trial, and we're waiting for those results. Hopefully they'll be published sometime in June this year at our major national meeting. We should get some preliminary results by that time, hopefully. If we look at Panobinostat, what I just showed you, the Panorama trials are ongoing right now, so there's 2 trials for patients in the first 3 lines of therapy. It's Velcade plus or minus Panobinostat for patients who are Velcade sensitive or naive. And there's 1 trial for patients who are Velcade refractory, looking at this combination as well. And so those are national trials that are available around the country. And again, if we look down at the bottom half, we'll see that there's a number of other kind of combinations that we're looking at. That's at MD Anderson, we're looking at the combination of carfilzomib plus Panobinostat. Thinking that carfilzomib may be a better proteasome inhibitor in terms of a little bit more activity, especially in Velcade refractory patients. If we combine it with Panobinostat, we may get higher response rates. And so we're doing this first trial in the country looking at this combination. Really very exciting that we're seeing 2 new drugs that are not FDA approved, trying to combine them together for patients. The third class of drugs I want to talk about briefly, again, is Pomalidomide. We alluded to this a bit earlier. Again, I think this is a very active and interesting drug. And so this is, again, kind of a 3rd generation of thalidomide, then Revlimid. Now we have Pomalidomide. And a lot of this work was done earlier by the Mayo Clinic group with Dr. Kyle and his colleagues. And so again, just to reiterate, when we looked at Pomalidomide as a phase 2 trial in patients with relapsed myeloma, we can see on the right-hand side in the yellow, the overall response rate was around 58%. And if we look at the bottom yellow part down here, among the 37 patients, of the 37 patients, 13 were truly Revlimid refractory, and response rates were about 30% in these patients. And so again, we're seeing that we're able to salvage or get some benefit in 30% of patients who are truly Revlimid refractory. We're starting to run out of other options. This is a second trial, again, a little bit larger trial with 34 patients, truly Len refractory or Revlimid refractory. If you look at the bottom line, the response rate is around 30% of these patients. This has been seen by this trial as well as other trials with pomalidomide. So we're trying to see response rates in the 30% range, even in the larger phase 2 trials. Again, this is a little bit different, again, with pomalidomide, where we don't see the neuropathy that we see with thalidomide as much. We'll see lower incidence of neuropathy, around less than 20%. And we do get some drops in blood counts as well, but it seems to be a fairly well-tolerated and safe drug as well. And so that's going on to some larger phase 3 trials, which will be coming into the U.S. shortly. So this was the data I was just showing you from the Mayo Clinic. There's another new class of drugs that we're looking at. In general, I'll just introduce them as something called monoclonal antibodies. So monoclonal antibodies are a different set of drugs that we've normally historically used. And these are typically smart drugs that are designed to find one specific focus or something on the cell surface of this myeloma cell, saying this is a bad myeloma cell and we're going to attack you as opposed to everything else. And so, for example, we use Rituxan in patients with lymphoma. And so there's a different other kind of drugs that are used in other diseases. There's no such thing as a monoclonal antibody that's been approved yet for myeloma, but that's what we're trying to move towards. So there's one drug called CENTO-328 or siltuximab. And so it targets a protein called IL-6. And IL-6 is a protein which basically feeds the myeloma cells, or it's a survival signal for those myeloma cells to keep surviving and keep growing. And what CENTO does, CENTO-328, is binds to this IL-6 and prevents the IL-6 from feeding or continuing this signal to this myeloma cells to keep growing. And so they did a trial here with Velcade plus CENTO-328. And you'll see a response rate of about 60% or 57% of these patients. And again, if you look at just single agent Velcade by itself, the response rate you expect is around 40%. So this is a bit better than you'd normally expect with Velcade alone, suggesting it is active. It doesn't have too many side effects that you'd expect when you have this kind of targeted therapy. There's some increased risk of infections with this and some infusion reactions when you're infusing it, but short of that, there's not too many other additional side effects that you'd normally expect from chemotherapy drugs. The second monoclonal antibody, which actually is very exciting, has really come out in the last year, is this drug called elotuzumab, which basically, if you look at the cell surface of this myeloma, so if outside of the myeloma cells, there's this protein that's expressed called CS1. So it's a cell surface CS1, and it's rather uniformly expressed in almost all of the myeloma cells. And so it's not expressed in half or 30%, it's expressed in the vast majority of those myeloma cells. If you look at them, you pull them out and you see this marker on them, you'll see this marker on them. So it becomes an important marker to go after. And they've developed this basically monoclonal antibody to target this specific protein. And what they did, again, when they did a single agent trial by itself, this drug was not active. You give it to patients, and really very few patients responded or just had stable disease. It was not a very active drug. But we had some strong kind of preclinical rationale. We were in the lab, we looked at it in combination with Revlimid and said, you know what, with Revlimid it might be an active drug combination, so let's look at it. And so they did this trial, basically giving Revlimid and low-dose dexamethasone, so standard Revlimid dosing. And they gave elotuzumab, which is the top line, which is hard to see, but they gave weekly elotuzumab as an IV infusion for the first 2 months, and then afterwards every 2 weeks.